to Whiskey Politics. This is Dave Sussman, your host and purveyor at whiskeypolitics.net. You can find us at America's Voice News television network. You can find our video series at YouTube. Don't forget to click subscribe and the notification bell, and your audio podcasts all over iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and the Ricochet Audio Network. You know, last Friday we had some really interesting economic news that came out, and we'd love to discuss it, pull it all apart. There's some indicators in there that are positive and some that are kind of threats. And to discuss all this, we love to welcome back to the show a good friend to the show, President for Americans for Tax Reform, Grover Norquist. Hi, Grover. Good to see you again.
Hi, Dave. Good to join you.
Thanks for returning back. First and foremost, a couple of things I just wanted to state. You know, we just saw some really mixed reviews on this economic report that just came out on Friday. I thought it was fantastic. The editorial board at IBD, Investors Business Daily, said Trump delivers for workers after years of empty Obama promises, somewhat partisan. But when the New York media suggests the economy is humming along nicely, people take notice. New Yorker magazine, I just want to read this one paragraph to you real quickly here. New York magazine stated on Friday that Donald Trump tweeted jobs, 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 and who could blame him? A couple of hours earlier, the Labor Department reported payrolls had increased by 340,000 in January, which was about 130,000 more jobs than economists on Wall Street had been predicting. Job gains were widely spread across the economy, with construction, healthcare, retail, leisure, and hospitality sectors showing particular strength, and wages are increasing at an annual rate more than 3%, and consumer price inflation is falling. You know, that sounds really positive right now, doesn't it?
It does. We were told when he got elected by Brookings Institute, a liberal establishment think tank, that the stock market would go down about 10 to 15%. Citibank, which isn't a liberal operation, said it would go down about 3 to 5%. In point of fact, stock market has increased dramatically, telling you that investors think that the economy is not only growing, but it will continue to grow, although the left has this new theory, oh, we told you it could never go to 3% a year. It was more than 3% last 12 months, in addition to which wages went up by 3% in 1 year, which is as high as it's been in quite some time. So more people working at higher wages, not more people working at lower wages, but higher wages, and people who invest in the stock market believe that this will continue because they continue to buy stocks and increase their price.
What are you seeing in some of those threats people are talking about? Is that due to economic conditions worldwide, China, trade, government shutdowns, what?
Well, the government shutdown may cost us $3-4 billion in an economy that is so much larger than that. It's not even a rounding error. So I didn't think shutdown was a good idea. It's not good for the economy, but it isn't slowing down economic growth. And everybody knew from the beginning that everybody who got laid off or wasn't getting paid for it would be paid completely exactly what they were had been expecting. Might be delayed, but they'd be paid. So everybody knew it was kind of a phony shutdown. In addition to which, 3/4 of the government was funded by a regular budget process. I mean, the real surprise here is that for the first time in many years, because all during the Obama years, they never did a budget. They always just did continuing resolutions at the end of the year, and they just kicked the can down the road. 3/4 of the budget actually went through the normal budget process, committees, House, Senate, conference, and that was pretty impressive. The fact that the shutdown was a mini shutdown rather than 100% was because of all the good work that was done by the Republican House, the Republican Senate, and President Trump. If the Democrats hadn't objected to the last bit, we'd have had that finished too. So that was getting done. I do worry about trade war with China. The president makes it clear he wants to use the threat of tariffs and tariffs, the implementation of tariffs, to get China to stop stealing our intellectual property, which is a real problem, but hundreds of billions of dollars. It's not not a made-up problem. It's a real problem. And it's one that, going back decades, American presidents have never taken the time or the effort to focus on to get China's attention. You know, we ask for it, like we ask NATO to please pay for some of their own national defense, but nobody does anything about it. When Trump, you know, knocks them on the side of the head and says, guys, you got to cover some of the costs. You got to help here. You know, we're defending you. You got to help too.
Yeah.
They act like he's being rude. And in jostling China on some of the trade challenges we have, it's also considered, you know, not done. It is dangerous. Let me be very clear. Trade wars can spiral in the wrong direction. It's not completely under your control. All wars are wars of choice, and all wars, the other team gets to decide when they're over. You don't get to decide when they're over. So it appears that we're coming to a conclusion that will be better for the United States and better for the world, and certainly better for stability. If that happens, I think the stock market's up several thousand points, because there is some uncertainty about what happens. You're having a fight with a dictatorship. They don't have to get elected. They can play games for quite some time, whereas we have to keep coming back to the American people. But Trump did wait until the economy was growing and strong before he threw a couple punches on trade with China. So he's arguing with China from strength.
How much of a motivator is it for China to come to the table that their economy is just been tanking the last few years?
Well, I've always been a believer that China, like Japan, is heading for what Japan had, which was a decade of almost no growth, the lost decade. Why?
Stagnation. Yeah.
Stagnation, because Japan had a lot of malinvestment, political investment. Countries that spend a lot of money on infrastructure. Infrastructure is a French word for big government, and for political spending rather than spending driven by what the market wants. Infrastructure, well, it's the things the market doesn't give you. Well, then maybe some of it people don't want. It's easy to build a road to nowhere, a bridge to nowhere, subways to nowhere. At some point, people make you change New Coke or Edsel or things in the private sector that aren't working. You can spend a lot of money, a lot of percentage of GDP on infrastructure, building cities and buildings that nobody lives in, roads nobody drives on, trains and subways that people don't use. Japan did that, and they had to work through it. China is in a similar situation. They had all their local governments borrow a lot of money, spend a lot of money. There's a huge amount of debt. We have debt in the national government. They have a lot of debt in the local government too. And at some point, that's going to have to work its way through. It's not going to be helpful to the rest of the world when China goes through it, just as it wasn't any help that Japan had to go through it.
Yeah.
But I'm less concerned that China is going to eat the world, because I grew up at a time when we were all told Japan was going to, for all the same reasons. They have the government making all these smart decisions, unlike America, where we just do stuff,
Right.
Because people want it.
Yeah. For those that are a little bit younger, if you're going to get a sense of what we were feeling in the 80s, watch Michael Keaton's Gung Ho. It's a good movie. In the last minute before our first break here,
sure.
Reading the tea leaves, that's an unfortunate analogy for China. Taking a look at there's reports coming out that they want to talk about wiping out some of our trade deficits. They're talking about, billions up to $1 trillion in trade deficit. They want to reduce that. Is that a good sign, or are they just playing?
I'm less interested in those kind of numbers and more interested in changing the rules, or rather having them follow the rules, that if we've patented something, they don't steal it.
Intellectual property theft.
Intellectual property theft, yeah.
Yeah.
Those are the really big numbers for fixing it.
Yeah, and that makes a huge difference on American companies. So it's somewhat of a protectionist approach that we're taking on that as well. But we need to protect that. I mean, we work really, really hard for those patents. And, if they can just make a Nike shoe or an Apple computer, and it's 90% difference in cost, we need to protect
copies
ourselves.
Of movies, frankly, copies of pharmaceuticals.
Great.
And just basically stealing the intellectual property.
We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, I want to get your impression upon what some of the feeling that we're seeing here in the United States right now regarding socialism. So we'll be right back with Grover Norquist here, Dave Sussman at Whiskey Politics. again, Dave Sussman back with you at Whiskey Politics, and I'm delighted to have with us Grover Norquist. And Grover, you could be found at, is it atr.org?
Yes, atr.org, and I tweet at Grover Norquist.
At Grover Norquist. And it's a great Twitter feed, folks. Definitely follow Grover. And it's not just about economics and politics. You do a lot of fun stuff as well. By the way, yeah. What did you, real quickly, what did you think of the Super Bowl?
Well, I'm originally, prior to moving to the United States, I grew up in Massachusetts. So I've been rooting for the Patriots. And I have to, because I have a 9-year-old daughter who's kind of obsessed with the subject.
Yeah, yeah. It was a little lackluster. Slow game, but you got to give credit to the Patriots where credit is due. They're probably one of the best sports teams of all time. Okay, so speaking of Massachusetts, Elizabeth Warren and her younger counterpart, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, they're coming up with this idea, and it's selling. It's selling. It's doing really, really well, and that is soak the rich. It's becoming popular. The politics of taxing the wealthy. There's been several polls that are coming out showing that between 70 to 76% of the American public agree to raising taxes on the wealthy substantially. Now, what is wealthy? That's the question. Some people say 10 million a year. Other people will think if you're making 100 grand a year, you're wealthy. So that's a question. But number one, is 70% tax on the wealthy enough to fund socialism? And number two, what the heck is happening in our country that socialism is suddenly popular?
Okay. Two things. One, we had 70% rate going in the 70s. We had 90% rate after World War II. Remember, the economy was doing so badly that the Democrats won with John F. Kennedy, the sort of nobody congressman, senator out of Massachusetts, beat the Vice President Nixon, who'd been with Eisenhower, who won World War II. But the economy was doing very poorly. He took the 90% rate down to 70. He took all the rates down across the board. Strong economic growth in the 60s. Nixon, unfortunately, raised taxes. The economy faltered. Reagan took the 70% rate down to 50 and then down to 28 and had strong economic growth 7 years in a row until George Herbert Walker Bush raised taxes and slowed the economy. When we moved away from 90 and away from 70, we saw strong growth. In addition to that, there's a wonderful chart that I just tweeted out from @Grover Norquist, which shows the top rate and how much of the total tax burden was paid by the top 1%. And as the rate came from 90 to 70 to 28 and came down, the higher income people were paying more of the total tax burden, and middle income people are paying less. So we know from American history and other countries that those top rates slow economic growth, but they don't get you net more money. And in fact, they keep the tax burden on the middle class. One big hint for some of our Democratic friends is when Cortez, Congresswoman Cortez, wants to look for a model of who's got 70%, she talks about the past. And that's right, because there isn't a country in the world today, not North Korea, not China, not some silly country in Latin America or Africa or someplace that you can't pronounce, okay? No country has 70% rate. Why? Because they looked and watched the United States go from 90 to 70, 70 to 50, 50 to 28, and they followed the American model, and those rates came down dramatically. The former communist countries, some have 15% flat rate taxes, lower than ours, better than the American tax structure. So no European country has a 70%. Sweden doesn't have a 70% rate.
Sweden's
Denmark,
about, the effective rate at Sweden right now, if I'm correct, is about 65%, isn't it?
About 60 if you add all of the various income taxes they have.
Right.
And 60 is also Denmark and Finland, and that's on the high end. Nobody else is quite there.
Yeah.
What's different between Sweden, Denmark, Finland, and the U.S., it's not the top rate. It's what they do to the middle class. Their income taxes on the middle income people there is about 10 to 15 points higher than in the United States. And they have a 20% value-added tax or a 20% sales tax. No American state has a 10% sales tax. So you're talking about another 10 to 15% taken away from middle-income people just whenever they buy stuff. And the VAT, worse than the sales tax, because it's everything. It's not just a few products. So the model that Cortez is talking about, social welfare democracy, welfare statism, is somewhat higher taxes rates on higher income people that will raise less money on higher income people, but massive increases in consumption taxes, the value-added tax. They call it a carbon tax or an energy tax, which is a way to just tax everything, and also higher income tax rates on middle-income people. So we've been where she wants to go. You may remember the Beatles song, 19 for the state, 1 for you, at 95% tax rate. That's why the Beatles moved to America.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think everybody who has lived a certain number of years has seen this cycle come and go. I'm originally from London, England, and everybody in my family, my parents, everybody needed to leave because you had socialism there in the 1970s. Yeah. So it's something that, they point to Denmark, they point to Sweden, and they use these statistics that most people who are low information voters that get their news basically from fortune cookies, on TV, in 5-second spots, they don't understand. And I think this is one of the biggest issues that we're facing. And I want to take this over, to the next section on this. And that is, are we not educating our kids anymore on this?
That's a real problem. Certainly the public school system is not very good at this. I went to the public school system, and their understanding of, us versus the Soviet Union wasn't any good. Never mind us versus France and Sweden. So there's some wonderful polling data that Scott Rasmussen's put together. When you get these millennials, they go, "Oh, I like socialism," because they don't know what it means. And I don't really think they mean the National Socialists, the Nazis. That was socialism, or the Soviet socialists. I mean, the amount of blood on the floor when the socialists go to do real work, Mao's communist China, socialist China, or Venezuela today. I mean, you do think maybe these guys would watch TV today. Maybe they don't know about the Soviet Union. Maybe they don't know what Nazi Germany was. Maybe they don't know what Mao's China was. But Venezuela is front and center for people to see what was a very wealthy country, now impoverished by too much government tax and spend and government running the economy, which leads to corruption and all sorts of things. That's a helpful education process. But what's the best news is when you ask these young people, do you think socialism would be a good idea? Should we try? So, oh, yes, say, some bizarre percentage. Then do you think socialism lead to smaller government or bigger government? Many of them think it leads to smaller government. So they really don't have any clue what they're talking about. And the left is making a big mistake. Don't tell them, okay? But in 92, the Democrats won the House, Senate, presidency. And they had the same conversation then when Clinton and the Democrats in the House and Senate came in. They said, everybody wants big government. They just voted for us. They want government-run health care. They want taxes. They want spending. And they did all that stuff, and they got thrown out of the House and the Senate 2 years later. And the Republicans took over and have basically kept the House and Senate most years since. Then, when Obama got elected in 2008 with the Democratic House and Senate supermajorities, they said, see, everybody wants all of our big government stuff just like we thought. They rammed it through, and they got thrown out of the House in 2 years, and they got thrown out of the Senate shortly thereafter. This time, instead of lying to the American people, Clinton said he'd never taxed anybody except the top 2%. That was a lie. He did an energy tax. Then Obama came in, I'll only tax top 1%, except he taxed almost everybody with various kinds of taxes in Obamacare. This time around, they're drinking their own Kool-Aid, they're reading their own stories, they're calling themselves on the phone and telling them what they want to hear, and they're announcing to the world what they're going to do. And that was good enough once they did it, they lost the House and Senate under Clinton, they lost the House and Senate under Obama. They're going to lose the House and Senate and maybe the presidency by advertising ahead of time what they plan to do, because they fooled themselves into thinking that it's popular. Gun control gets popular until they pass it, then it's not.
Let's continue. You're certainly talking from experience, somebody who was within the Reagan administration. And then right after the break, I want to talk a lot more about this and the coming war between Mick Mulvaney and Maxine Waters. We'll be right back here with Grover Norquist, Dave Sussman at Whiskey Politics. And Dave Sussman back with you at Whiskey Politics, and I'm very happy to have with us Grover Norquist, president of Americans for Tax Reform. And again, ATR.org, and follow Grover at Grover Norquist on Twitter. Great feed. And of course, you can continue to follow us at America's Voice News and all of our YouTube and podcast versions. Just look for Whiskey Politics. So, okay, this is incredible to me because I'm looking here at Maxine Waters, who I think outside of her contingency and her voters, most people think she's at best a little abrasive. She is now going to be heading the Financial Services Committee in Congress. What are we looking at here as far as financial policy in this country when you have somebody that has just such a lurid history and so much crony capitalism and corruption, and who's going to be basically dictating what's going to be happening from Congress as far as the financial services in this country?
If you got your information from the New York Times or the Washington Post or the three networks, you'd think the story of the last 30 years was the Republican Party's moved so far to the right, okay? Because that's all they want to talk about. What they've missed is the Republican Party and Democrats have separated largely because the left, the Democrats, have gone just crazy to the left. And because they live in these little redistricted districts that give them complete control, they can be crazier and crazier and still get reelected. Then they don't have term limits for their committee chairs or ranking members like the Republicans do. So the committee chairs coming in, the Democrats won the House, are about 20 years older on average than the Republicans they replaced. Republicans get to be a committee chair. You do that for 6 years. You go retire. You do something else. We cycle people through. So our people, walk to work. And their guys are older and older and more detached because they live in districts that are everybody thinks the same. Nancy Pelosi's never run into anybody who didn't agree with her on everything. And first of all, she lives in a gated community. But in her social
outside of her district, so they're older, which means they're full of older thoughts. And people tend to learn where they are in politics when they're 20 and then not really update it unless something tragic or big happens in their life. And they're hard left because the districts allow it. And so you're going to have a number of those committee chairs. Here, bottom line. Nothing good happens that requires Nancy Pelosi's permission. So for the next 2 years, there are no good pieces of legislation that will pass in the House and the Senate. There'll be some less awful stuff that gets passed. Progress will be judges, 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 judges. Progress will be deregulation and letters of guidance that can undo the damage of the Clinton years, frankly, some of the Bush years, and the Obama years, and over-regulating. When George Herbert Walker Bush, who followed Reagan, left office, Congressman Dick Armey pointed out that at the time, 25% of all the regulatory burden facing Americans had been imposed by the Bush administration, 41. That's Reagan had held back like a dam, had held back the floodwaters of over-regulation, and Bush didn't understand. He thought Reagan was leaning against the wall. He didn't realize how much work that took. And massive regulation there. And then, of course, the pace was picked up by Clinton and Obama. So undoing that wave of over-regulation, getting judges that actually have read the Constitution from time to time, that's what we can do in the next 2 years. I don't look for any good piece of legislation to actually be enacted. We'll have to do a budget. It'll be ugly. It'll be full of shards of glass, and they'll keep telling us it's pizza, and we should eat it. One of those pieces of regulation was a new committee that was formed in the Obama years, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, CFPB. Yeah. And Maxine Waters has been quoted to say that she's going to be using that as a tool to basically increase regulation. That as a department on its own has been reported to become an outpost of anti-business activism. The people that are working within that department. How can you contain that today?
Well, you do have leadership that's been put in by Trump, and so there's some control. They tried to make it completely independent of anybody and stacked with left of center people. I think it's probably unconstitutional the way it's structured. That was not the view of Obama and Clinton appointees, but I think we'll see the idea of setting up an agency independent of Congress and sticking power over there. That's not in the Constitution anywhere. So that effort, I think, will be called back, one, by the courts, and two, by some competent people that Mulvaney and Trump have put over in that department that have kept it somewhat from going out off the deep end. A Democrat president, and then they're off to the races.
Well, based upon, and I want to talk about this in our last section coming up here, but based upon the people that have already thrown their hat in the ring, you're talking about some extreme leftists approaching this from the standpoint. I mean, this is scaring because, Trump is certainly not guaranteed re-election at this point.
He's not. I think the economy is doing very well. That's helpful. Reagan got 49 states with a strong economy. The wind at his back. Trump has much better judges than Reagan ever could. Federalist Society and others basically made it easier for Trump to find vetted judges. I mean, Reagan and Bush both put some people in. It turned out not to be that good. They thought they were getting the best you could, but there was no vetting process back then that went back to when people were in school, so you could have some sense of where their constitutional guts come from. So
a lot of people say that pendulum swung way too far, though. Right? I mean, when you're talking about yearbooks, come on.
Oh, but I'm not interested in that sort of stuff, but it's helpful to know that somebody has felt since their 20s that you should go to the Constitution to decide what the court should do and not your friends in the sociology department at Berkeley.
Or trying to reinterpret the law. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So, so with that being said, I mean, what Mulvaney, and I know he's transitioning now, but he seems to be somebody that has been somewhat of a firewall against this push from the left, using CFPB, for example, as an activist to arm. If Maxine Waters and the rest of Congress are going to be pushing with investigations and using tools, pro-union departments like that, is it just going to be it's just going to be a wall? I mean, what are we looking at here? Is anything going to be done in the next couple of years?
Well, we can do some more deregulation there. Mulvaney's replaced himself with a competent a leader who will continue to move in the direction Mulvaney did. There are other appointments yet to be made. Waters and the Democrats in the House, they don't have the Senate, they don't have the presidency, they have the House. They can scream and yell, and they can try and stick riders into pieces of legislation. The Senate can say no, and the White House can say no, but some riders will get through because when you have to compromise and you have to do a budget or you have to do a increase in the debt ceiling, the left will have some painful concessions that they will extract. So it's not all win-win-win. I mean, when the Republicans had the House, they made Obama eat a lot of stuff that he didn't want to do.
And you think that at the very end of the day, executive orders or things like this could be used?
Oh, sure. There's a lot that can be done by executive order. Much of the damage Obama did and Clinton did were executive orders.
Right.
And so you can undo them the same way. Now, when they did them, people said, oh, I have a pen, I have a phone. Isn't that clever on the part of Obama? People talked about, oh, wow, signature law of the land under Clinton. It was considered cute and interesting that they were exhibiting this kind of executive power. When Trump uses the same authority to undo something, then he's an authoritarian and undermining democracy. There's nothing democratic about imposed laws by some bureaucrat, and undoing a bureaucrat's imposed rules is not threatening anybody. It's actually liberating people and moving towards liberty. So the left will scream, but much can yet be done on deregulation. Much can be done with the judges that Trump has appointed and will continue to appoint.
Gotcha.
Changes. The world's moving in the right direction day by day.
Last segment coming up right after the break here, and I want to talk about the politics of our time and how it impacts our economy. We'll be right back with Grover Norquist. And Dave Sussman back with you at Whiskey Politics. And again, find us at America's Voice News and all of your podcast applications and YouTube. And we have Grover Norquist, president at AmericansForTaxReform.org, ATR.org, and his Twitter handle, Grover Norquist. I was talking with a good friend of mine the other day. He works for a large television network, and I will not say the name, but everybody watches them. He was telling me he's been in ad sales for 20 plus years over there, and he was telling me that after the holidays, ad sales have dropped off a cliff. He's never seen this before, and he's deeply concerned. And this is not somebody that is political in any way with their perception of the economy. I know we have perceptions of the economy based upon who's in the White House. So this is obviously anecdotally speaking here, but one of the things that the NFIB, National Federation of Independent Businesses, which is a firm that I follow very closely. I know you're familiar with them. They rank Small Business Optimism Index. It's a monthly report that comes out, and they talk to small business owners all across the country about how optimistic they are. Some of the biggest threats over the years have been Obamacare, taxes, regulation, things like this as well. While they remain high right now, Grover, business owners are saying that they are expecting sales to drop precipitously later this year. They're pointing to what we've already discussed, trade wars and government shutdowns and things like this as well. But my concern, and I'd love your perception on perspective on this, my concern is that the economy is changing. We're transitioning into something much, much different. Television ad sales are down because I cut the cord 3-4 years ago. I'm not the only one to do this. How do we transition in an economy when industries, many of them are going to be going away or become obsolete, and keep productivity up, sales up, and other things like that as well?
Oh, sure. Look, we need to remember that every month, millions of jobs disappear and millions of jobs are added. So when they tell you 100,000 new jobs, that's not the only thing that happened. Literally, several million jobs disappeared, several million jobs came into being. It is a very, very dynamic economy. 100 years ago, 75% of people in the country worked on the farm. Now it's 2%. They're not all unemployed. They're doing other things. And some of those changes took place very rapidly, and it's always disruptive. But the most important thing we can do when we go into disruption, when Uber comes in and disrupts the taxi commission, is to have strong economic growth, because then there are jobs for people who spin off. A lot of those people who work in the federal government shouldn't be there. They should be somewhere else. And we need to create the jobs in the private sector so that we can downsize the federal government and state government and local government to get those sectors more productive.
And what's the best tool to use to do that, to achieve that, increase jobs?
Well, step one, tax rates. I mean, tax rates matter. Taking the corporate rate from 35, which was highest in the world. The American corporate tax rate was higher than any other country. Communist China was 25%. We were at 35. Germany was at 25%. We were at 35. I mean, this is ridiculous. Hungary's at 9. Ireland's at 12.5. We needed to take that rate down to become competitive and to get growth moving again. And the other one is no new regulations. And just a breather there is a big help, and continue to undo the regulations that have been piled up over the last 20 years. And I would add to that, we've made a push to allow people to look for more energy in the country. And we have dramatically increased energy production. Texas produces more energy than all but 2 or 3 countries in the world. We're producing enough to export. We're a net exporter. the level of energy production and sales in this country are at record highs. And we were told only a few years ago that we were at peak oil, that we were running out of oil, that we'd never produce as much oil as we did last year, and it's going to keep going down. Trump has broken through so many barriers that we were told this can never happen. When he was elected, we were told the economy was going to collapse. It didn't. We were told it could never grow more than 1.5% or 2%. We're now at 3%. We were told you can't ever drill in Anwar. Now we just legally changed the law that energy prices will, always be too high. Well, actually, they've been coming down. That you can't up the amount of production. Yes, we have, and we're becoming competitive in the world. And as deregulation continues to kick in, all of those things get better.
You worked with Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. You were, much younger, but obviously still feeling the same that you feel now about the economy and what stimulates growth. You've seen this for the past 30 years or plus, and yet at the same time, the bipartisan approach to the economy seems to be more divided than ever before. It's all about, in today's case, the bad orange man or whatever it may be. And so my question to you is that you got a lot done with Ronald Reagan in the 1980s with a Democrat Congress. Tip O'Neill fought every step of the way. What can Trump do today to try to bring some people over without the personality aspect of hate everything he stands for?
I think keep reaching out to the American people and explaining what he's doing. He needs to tweet and to talk. I mean, the press hates tweeting because then information gets out to the American people, not through a leak to CBS, but directly to you. I mean, there's a disintermediation. I think it's great that the president and agencies and the government immediately tell everyone in the world, here's what we're doing. Not tell somebody at CBS who puts their own spin on it and then sort of tells you, maybe not, what they think is happening today. We're actually getting better information, but because the left and the right disagree, it's going to be a bumpy ride. They're not going to agree that the left has built up structures that require billions of dollars of forced union dues to fund them. And with the court decision in Janus, which says the government cannot force people who work for the government to pay union dues to left-wing unions, that's hundreds of millions and over the next few years, billions of dollars lost to the left. They are grumpy. They're going to get more grumpy. And there's a whole series of challenges that the left is going to have to deal with. And if one party wants to go lower taxes and one party wants to go higher taxes, what in the world would bipartisan compromise look like? Taxes go up, Republicans lost. Taxes go down, Democrats lost. So you can have bipartisan agreement if both parties are competing to make the government bigger, as they were when Nixon and Kennedy both wanted bigger government. Not, Kennedy wanted more bigger government, and Nixon wanted less bigger government, but they both ended up wanting bigger. On taxes and spending and regulation, Republicans and Democrats are in two different directions. And the left, you talked about all those candidates.
Depends which Republican you're talking about, though, right? I mean, we take a look at W. Bush, and he had some of the biggest increases in Medicare spending ever. I mean, so I guess the question is a slowing growth of spending actually a cut, right?
It's a good first start to slow the growth, but we do need to get significant reduction. We need to reform government so it costs less. We need to block grant all the welfare programs, not just aid to families with dependent children, and put caps on it. This is what we were going to do until we threw away a Senate seat in Alabama and lost our
margin. Can you explain block granting?
Block granting is you go to aid to families with dependent children, Medicaid, food stamps, other programs, and say, okay, we've been giving your state $1 billion for this program. So we're going to give you $1 billion and we'll allow it to grow with inflation, but not faster than inflation. And by the way, now you get to make all the decisions about how to deal with welfare or public housing or health care, food stamps, or cash benefits. You make the decisions, and then we'll have 50 states trying to find out what works. Right now we have one big, everybody has to do it the same way, so it's hard to learn what works, what doesn't work. When we did this under Clinton, Clinton signed the bill for aid to families with dependent children, classic welfare. We saw costs go down 30, 40%. Every state ended up spending less money except Hawaii, for reasons I've never fully understood. But Hawaii went in the wrong direction. The other 49 went in the right direction. But you know what? That's on Hawaii. They decided to do that. And the other states, some states saw even more dramatic reductions. We could do that with a lot of the government programs. And 50 states competing to provide the best government at the lowest cost is a big advantage over one government just making decisions day to day and having no feedback. How do you tell whether it's working or not if there's nothing to compare it with?
How else can you incentivize states or municipalities to, whether it's line item vetoes or having balanced budget amendments? Outside of that, what can you do?
A number of states have gone fully transparent, so you can see every check that they write in Texas, Missouri. Ohio's pretty good. Statewide, what we really need is local governments need to become as transparent as state governments have. If you knew how much money the mayor was spending in different places, you might get a new mayor, or the mayor might spend less and more competently. Transparency is a big, big step in the right direction. Supermajorities to raise taxes, a number of states have that. Florida, Nevada require 2/3 vote. I think Washington State 3/5 vote to raise taxes.
Is it helping in California?
Well, it did until they got 2/3. It's what helped California from going off the edge until just recently, and then they will lose their 1/3 or their 2/3 supermajority at some point. We'll at least have that protection. It's an important protection, but you also need to win elections.
Yeah. Last question for you, and I greatly appreciate you taking the time, Grover. Obviously, we're at the beginning of the second half of Trump's first term. He is now facing Nancy Pelosi, who wants to stop him doing everything and anything Trump wants to do. How do you feel about the next 2 years?
The next 2 years, the good news is we're going to get a lot of very good judges, and that will change the world. We're going to get a lot of good judicial decisions, which move the world in the right direction. Second piece of good news is a lot of deregulation can happen through executive order. And there's a lot you can do by managing the government more competently. The bad news is that legislatively, whenever we do budgets, the Democrats can stick shards of glass into that piece of legislation, and it's hard to pick them all out. It's hard to have that kind of clout. You have to shut the government down a bunch of times to do that, and there's not a lot of interest in that. Obama gave tremendous concessions to the Republicans when all they had was the House. I fear we're going to get very unhappy at some things that we will lose, at some progress that will be, they'll try and roll back. But overall, we will continue the trend forward that Trump's put forward. Strong economic growth makes that easier.
On the government shutdown, how much of that is real leverage now by the Republicans? Every single time we've had a government shutdown, Republicans in polls get blamed.
Well, there was one time at the beginning, about a year ago, or 2 years ago, when Schumer was trying to push a government shutdown, and the D's senators were saying, "You're killing us," going into 2016. 2018. They were very worried, and they got him to back down. It doesn't help when Trump says, "I'm going to do this, shut the government down." What you want to say is, I want to have a border security. I hope the Democrats don't shut the government down over my fighting for border security. You want the other team to throw the punch. You want the other team to get credit. And when Ted Cruz said, I think shutting the government down would be a good idea back when he first did it, hoping to end Obamacare. If you take credit for it, you take the blame for it. You want the other team to be responsible for any sort of shutdown, because we're being reasonable,
Well, let's see what happens with all of this. You're optimistic. You believe regulations are still going to be decreased, and
Yes.
and that's going to be helpful. Hopefully, we can figure out a way to deal with healthcare and the border, because I think those are the two biggest issues that Republicans voted many of their representatives into the House for. So let's see what happens with all of this.
Absolutely.
So,
And there's been some tremendous progress on healthcare through deregulation to give people options around Obamacare.
they need to be sold more to the American public, and people need to be able to find out what those options are, because everybody's getting killed by healthcare right now. We all know that. But anyway, again, greatly appreciate you taking the time, Grover. Grover Norquist, you can be found at atr.org, and your Twitter handle, Grover Norquist.
That's me.
All right. Follow this man, folks. Brilliant. Again, thank you so much. And folks, continue to find us at Whiskey Politics all over social media as well, and YouTube, America's Voice News, and the Ricochet Audio Network. Again, very special thanks to Grover Norquist, and we'll be back again very soon at Whiskey Politics.